Hey, Dick.
Hi there, Steve. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you today?
Good. Should be an interesting session today.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to definitely leave early, but
Okay.
and Zach has already talked on this before, hasn't he, for preschoolers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Some of them, part of, but not all of them. I didn't send you a copy. There's a new paper by Zach on the called The Substance of Urban Politics, which is a comparison of voting in city council in Chicago and Toronto. I don't think I sent it to you all.
I think I might have it though, actually.
Okay.
Let me look. I think
There's also
yeah.
the other UAR article. Okay.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
So we're going to try and cover scenescapes and the UAR article and the voting study.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
That's a lot. And
But
it's
it's gonna be
very
good.
complicated. Yeah.
So I'll be quiet. I'll be off to the side, probably in and out, but because it's
Yeah. And
full day of meeting.
you're a historian. What do you know about all these numbers, right?
No, today I've been swamped with every meeting possible. Backlog.
And next week after Dennis, we will be sending out a book manuscript on modern mayors. And then we have
Hi,
2 weeks
Professor
of
Simpson,
that.
Professor
Hi there,
Corey.
Rodrigo.
How are you?
Hello. Yeah, I look forward to that manuscript. That'll be great.
Yeah, it's coming together pretty well.
Excellent.
Welcome, everyone. We'll be underway in just a couple of minutes. Welcome, Zach. We're glad to have you joining us.
Glad to be here. Dan will show up soon, I'm sure.
Okay. I'll tell Dan when he gets here. What I'm hoping to do is to divide the class into 3 half-hour segments, starting with Scenescape and then going to the UAR article and then going to your new article on the city councils. And take a half hour
Okay.
on each of them. You know, I think that'll let us cover the material. We may not be able to cover everything, but some things, you know, people can just read. I very much liked your article, by the way. When we get to it, I'll have a little commentary on the city council studies.
Okay, well, especially in the Chicago context, nobody knows it better than you. So, you know, I'm very interested in hearing what you think rings true and what doesn't. So.
Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting for the other students in the class and for our other presenter, and we'll be underway. We'll wait just one more minute and then we will get underway. Hi, Dan, how are you?
Pretty good. How's it going?
Good. I mentioned to Zach what we'll make just a 1-minute introduction in just 1 second. But what I'd like to do is to start with Scenescapes, which we discussed with Terry last week, but only the first part. And then move to the UAR article and then move to Zach's new article. Spending maybe a half hour on each. Maybe we could have, 10 or 15 or 20-minute presentation. Hopefully everyone has read them. And then there'll be time for questions, and then we'll have nearly an hour. We take a 15-minute break. We go from 4 to 5 and then take a 15-minute break and then come back to 6:30 Central Standard Time. And I think that will work out fine. If we need more time for some section, we'll take a little more time. But this is very interesting material. For the class who are present now, as you know, Dan Silver and Zach Taylor are with us today. They're doing their work is on Chicago, but also particularly Toronto and some other places as well. London comes into play on some of their work. And so, Dan, maybe we'll start with you, and perhaps you could, understanding that Terry has already covered the first few chapters, so we sort of know what a scene is in general terms. You could pick up on Scenescapes and what Scenescapes does and doesn't accomplish, what issues in using the Scenescape analysis come about, and whatever else we should know about this, I think, rather new and exciting extension of what the old Chicago and the new Chicago school studied as neighborhoods.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Dick. Okay, I have to adjust on the fly. I didn't know Terry was talking about it last week, so I will
He
do
only
my
covered
best.
the first part. As you know, with Terry, he covered everything from Marx to Keoki. So, but he did manage to tell us about zip codes and the yellow pages and stuff.
Okay, maybe I think when he and I talk about it, we sometimes come at it from different angles. So I'll quickly, but I'm going to start at the beginning, but then because I need to kind of work up. But I would probably take about a half hour, right? Is that what I thought we were doing? But I can slow down or speed up as we go along. So please, if I'm repeating what he said too much, or if I'm going to do something else, but I'll try to skim through that. But I think I give a different accent to it often. Okay, can I share?
Yes, I'm sorry. Let me, I'll set that up so you can.
Yep.
Give me just 1 second. I'll make you both co-hosts. So you're a co-host and I'll continue that with Zach.
Got it. Okay. So you see that, right?
We can.
Excellent. Okay. So yeah, I'll give an introduction and overview, but I'll try to be a bit more sort of prospective towards some of the consequences and effects. And I may, if I get there, or we can come back to it, we can look at some sort of hot off the press or hot out of our studio analysis on trends and changes that I've just been doing in Chicago, which are completely raw, unanalyzed at this moment, but maybe people have some interesting ideas about what they mean, so we can talk together about it. Okay, so there's the book. I think you all had some conversation already. I'm going to start with some general principles that inform this way of thinking that for me are really important, and it sort of can't be stressed enough. One is sort of, we really find it valuable to stress multidimensionality. I'm going to say these in an abstract way, and then I'm going to try to ground them. multidimensionality is whatever we're trying to understand, we shouldn't try to reduce it to one single cause. There's many dimensions that are engaged in various kinds of complex interactions. First principle. Second follows from that, whatever we're thinking about, if we're thinking about neighborhoods, they're in interaction with one another. If we're thinking about individuals, they're engaged in all sorts of dynamic interactions with one another. If we're thinking about abstract sort of domains like the economy or politics and so on, they're going to be in interchange with one another. So we have to think about those. Combinatorial thinking, once we're thinking about multiple dimensions, we also have to think about the ways that they produce different configurations when they combine. So neighborhood type A next to neighborhood type B is not the same thing as neighborhood type A next to neighborhood type C. And so we need to think through the meaning of different combinations. And we'll see this coming up again in the work with Zach in various ways. And then this all finally comes together in holism, so that if we think about different dimensions combining, a neighborhood, again, I'll be sort of think forward to the scenes types of dimensions, a place that combines transgressiveness, edginess with a kind of spirit of personal self-expression, and is along with, let's say, a sense of local authenticity, is one kind of place. And the strong emphasis on the local might lead you to think of a kind of small town that's a little bohemian village. But if you combine the same exact dimensions, not with like the sense of the local, but with something more kind of cosmopolitan, then you end up with a more kind of, big city kind of bohemian kind of setting. And so the combination of things produce different wholes. Now, those are analytical principles. And what we try to do is build up the book and the kind of conceptual framework around sort of being true to those principles. And so the first step in that process is trying to think about what a scene is, or really in terms of, again, staying true to this idea of multidimensionality, different ways in which people, us, can interact with places. There's different modes of interaction with places. So we can all sort of relate to a place as someone who's working there. And in that case, we're a producer. And the stuff in the area, the physical units, we're relating to them as firms, places to work. And with the relationships we have with other people and the places there are our production relationships, like your colleagues at work, your boss, you're an investor, whatever they are. That's one way of relating to the stuff in the area. But you can also relate to the stuff in the area in different ways as a resident. Of course, you could both work and live in the area, but there are different ways of relating to the same things in the area. And when you're relating there to the stuff in the area as a resident, you're relating to it as homes, apartments, places to live there, and your relationship is with other people who live there or may consider living there, or who have the kind of stake in the place that residents have. You can also relate to an area in terms of politics. And in that case, you are conceiving yourself and the others there as, let's say, citizens or activists or leaders or political officials. The activity you're involved in would be, let's say, advancing a particular cause, ideology, issues. You'd be trying to generate power, and the goal is some sort of action rather than going to work and producing something or buying and selling something, or as a resident being concerned with services, necessities, housing, safety, and the like. There's another way to relate to things in your neighborhood or any place that you're at, is as a cultural consumer, as a consumer, concerned with the style, the ambiance, the vibe of a place. Like, what does it mean? And you can, again, go to the exact same place. You can go to a cafe as somebody who's going to be working there. You can go to a cafe as someone who's meeting there to plan out your political strategy. And you can go there as somebody who is there to enjoy to enjoy what it has to offer. And in that way, and of course, those will overlap in many interesting ways. And when you relate to a place in that way, you're relating to it as amenities. In terms of the lifestyles that they evoke and the style, the ambiance, and ultimately the scene that they all kind of generate. So that kind of logic is what guides the structure of our book, actually. And I don't know if this came out clearly with Terry, but I just want to just bring it out because there's a structure to it. So what we're trying to do is articulate, unpack this way of relating to the world, give it some sort of flesh and bones. And that's what we do in the first kind of 3 chapters here. And then, staying true to this principle of interchange and combinatorial thinking, the rest of the book is saying, okay, now we've got an idea about how to conceptualize and measure this dimension of a place, the kind of lifestyle, mood, scene it evokes, we're going to now think about how that relates here to the economy. So interchange it with this dimension. Depending on the kind of scene you have, this kind of style of the place, what kinds of firms, production, economy, do they help to facilitate and foster or not? Then we will relate it to residential. So we'll think about how, depending on the kinds of amenities and opportunities for experiences that a place offers, how does that affect the kinds of people who live there, stay there, leave, and so on. And then we go on to talk about here in politics. So depending on the type of scene that you have, what sorts of political organizations do tend to thrive in that kind of setting, what kinds of political orientations do people there tend to have, and so on. So that's really this core of the structure of the book, coming right out of these kinds of concepts. And then we go on to later in the book talk about policy ideas for potentially trying to try to push things towards one kind of scene or another. And then we get into the methodology here at the end. So there's a kind of logic guiding the entire book. So I'm going to say a little bit more about these things, just to give you a feel for it. And then so you have some grounding in what's going on when we get into the consequences for the economy, residents, and politics. So what does it mean to take the scenic route? And I mean that both in the literal sense of any of us walking around, driving, and deciding to do it scenically, and also as social researchers, what does it mean to take that scenic route in our thinking? And in general, you're on the scenic route, imagine you're driving around and you say, oh, you could go the scenic route, or we could just get there the fastest from point A to B as fast as you possibly could, right? And when you're on that route, what you're doing is, even if you are actually on the fastest route, you can treat it as a kind of scenic route. And what you're doing is tuning in one way or another, appreciating, that's a key word, the qualitative character of the passing scenery. So if you're driving along the coast somewhere, it would be, oh, that's an awesome coastline. It's a quaint village. It's a foreboding mountain range. And those kinds of words, awesome, quaint, foreboding, those are like the qualitative characteristics of places. And the scenic route, when it comes to urban community research, is to apply that same style of thinking to the neighborhoods and communities that we move around in. What are the kinds of qualitative characteristics, like awesome, quaint, or foreboding, that we appreciate and become drawn into in one place or the other? How can we kind of codify that and think about how to measure them and their different combinations of what consequences they may have for our economy, politics, and residents? So that's the kind of intuition guiding things. Terry probably talked about this stuff, so I won't go into too much detail, but we have a kind of conceptual framework for thinking about how to turn into social science, like these qualitative characteristics, like in this case, awesome, quaint, and foreboding. And what we try to think about are these three broad dimensions: the theatricality, the authenticity, and the legitimacy that is evoked, the sense of those things that is evoked by the collection of amenities, activities, people, practices going on in a place. And broadly, what we mean by that is, we're talking about theatricality is like, what way of seeing other people and being seen by other people is kind of forwarded or advanced or attacked, by the set of things going on in a place. Is it a place that is a way saying, yeah, be glamorous, shine, wear something really, really fancy tonight, and get people with some bling and zing to look at you, right? Or is it more, be neighborly, fit in, be quaint, warmth, intimate? Is it transgressive? Put on your black eyeliner and some body piercing and tattoos. Those are the ideas of theatricality. There's another sense, that places do say something also about what's the right or wrong way to live. Are they saying, conform to tradition? Like you walk through like an ancient city with churches going back thousands of years, and they're telling you, conform to tradition. Or are they saying, the thing to do is express yourself, become, unique, and do something in your own way in a place, let's say, with improv comedy and jazz clubs all over the place, right? They're very different kinds of notions about the right way to be, and they're going to be expressed in the stuff that's there, the thing, who's there, what they're doing. Last, we talk about authenticity. Again, places are going to be saying something about what's real and what's fake, right? What does it mean to be real? And what does it mean to be fake? That's what we mean by authenticity, right? And you can go to a place and you can say, oh man, like, yeah, like that place felt so authentic. Everything was very local. It was grounded in the local tradition. Or no, right? It wasn't very authentic at all. It was faux local, right? That's the notion of something being real or fake. We have various dimensions of that. We can think of something as being authentic and coming out of an ethnic community and its traditions. Something could be authentic by resisting corporateness. Oh, I don't want that, that inauthentic corporate stuff. Or sometimes corporateness itself can be a source of authenticity. Like, I got to get the Gucci bag. I don't want a fake Gucci bag, right? So all of these have different notions of what is what's real and what's fake. So we're trying to sort of, take that intuition about places having a qualitative character that we can tune into, give some sort of formal structure to it, and then we measure it. Now, we did this initially something like 15 years ago, actually. And this was, when the concept of big data was just like a twinkle in nobody's eye, actually. It hadn't even been formulated. We didn't know we were doing big data, but we were. So because we ended up doing is just downloading all of, the yellow pages, which at the time people knew what the yellow pages is. I don't know if anyone even knows what the yellow pages is, but they're business directories or organizational directories. And, they told you how many of all of these things there were. And we also went to data sources like the county business patterns, zip code business patterns, which have all this information about it's called business, but it's really, these are government from the census. They're organizational listings, and they include not just, what we think of as for-profit businesses, but like churches and arts organizations and nonprofits and so on. So we get all that information, we code it all in terms of these kinds of dimensions with the whole team trying to work on that. And putting all that together, we get a read on the type of scene in a place based on the set of these dimensions that all of these amenities concentrated in one place or another are evincing. So just to ground it again, that this is measuring something real, you can just see, like, and this is for Canada. These are the, oh, by the way, we have this for all the zip codes in Canada, all in United States, all the postal areas in Canada. This one's Canada, but we get something similar in the US. So, and this is one approach to measurement that I call an inductive approach. We just didn't define ahead of time what we were looking for. Besides these dimensions, and then we use it through a factor analysis, what are the kind of most typical combinations of things that we find, and then thinking combinatorically. This is the most common sort of divide in the scenes in the US, community versus society. If, as I'm sure everybody's read, their Ferdinand Tönnies, the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft. So, but to show what it's actually measuring, these are places that are stronger in these dimensions that we call more communitarian, tradition, local, neighborly, less strong in utilitarian, rational, corporate. What does that really mean? Rationalist. What does that really mean? Well, these are places that have like a lot of religious organizations, museums, historical heritage sites, farms, bed and breakfast, nature parks. So you could get a picture of the kind of place this is, right? And they have not so many management consulting, real estate brokers, human resources consulting, R&D, data processing, right? There's like a feel that comes out from that. I'll just tell you about one other, just get it in the top Canadian one. And see, there's my upper left. There's my graphical rendering of what that's like. The upper right is the next one. I call it romanticism, and the dimensions, it's strong, this notion of personal self-expression, transgression, and also nature. We measure that in Canada, but not the US. And it's also weak. It doesn't have so much rationalism, utilitarianism, or in this case, not so much strict formality, right? You see the picture. Like, you wouldn't really want to be dressed up to go to work in that kind of setting. But you can see what don't they have much of? Investment advice, portfolio managers, lawyers, right? That's not what you're doing in that setting. But they do have things like bars, butchers, pastry shops, interior decorating, brasserie, boutiques, retreats, theater companies, ATVs, outdoor rec centers, independent artists, saunas, relaxation. You get the feel, right? So we're measuring these sort of various different kinds of feels that you have in one place or another. This is a different approach to measuring, and it's a deductive approach, so I won't go into that. Just to give, and again, so now I'm going to give a little bit more of a tour around the scenescape. Now starting from the amenities themselves and working up. So these are the top, now this is as of about 10 years ago. And again, I'm gonna look at trends. These are the top top zip codes in the USA for restaurants, yoga, equestrian, golf and country clubs, and bowling. You can see, New York dominates for restaurants. You don't get down to anywhere else till you get down to like, 10 or 11. There's Chicago. But if you want to find a lot of yoga, go to Boulder. Well, New York's there too. Also, Little Santa Cruz, California, a hippie town, just 45 minutes from where I grew up. Equestrian, here's Kentucky. Bowling, Butler, Pennsylvania. The point is that these, sort of lifestyle indicators, they don't follow directly from population. These, you don't have to be the biggest. It's not just that New York will have the most of everything. And these reveal something about the different cultures and lifestyles embedded in these different places. Just these simple counts. So now let's compare Chicago, New York, LA. And what we're doing is what I like to call quantitative flânerie. I don't know if Terry used that concept, but maybe he did talk about the flaneur, a kind of figure memorialized by the great French poet Charles Baudelaire. And the flaneur was somebody who would wander around Paris and taste the different scenes it has to offer, dive into them, but then go on to the next one, never get too fully embedded in one or the other. And that gave the flaneur a kind of, a sense for what it's like to be inside of each kind of scene, but at the same time, the ability to kind of compare and contrast them and have some distance. So that combination of intimacy and distance is what we're going for. But now we're doing it from our computer screen, right? So we're kind of walking around the world doing this kind of quantitative flânerie. So here, this is just a summary of the number of these different kinds of establishments per zip code across Chicago, New York, and LA. So you can get a feel. And this is a theme we'll see throughout, that there is a kind of common shape. It comes out more clearly in the next slide, but then there's differences within them. So you see here at the top, that's New York, way more art galleries. But Chicago and LA are not that different from each other. But for antique and classical car dealers, more in LA, fits with your LA lifestyle. Talent agencies, LA, way more than the others. But Catholic churches, Chicago. That tells you something about, the basis of social life in Chicago. American restaurants, Chicago. Family restaurants, Chicago. Public libraries, Chicago. Parks and playgrounds, Chicago. But independent writers and performers, LA. Every waiter you meet in LA is an actor. And so on and so forth, all the way down. Delicatessens, New York, right? Now we translate that into our measurement scheme here, the 15 dimensions. And again, you see, I'm trying to get you to believe that these abstract dimensions we have, are grounded in something intuitive. And so when we do analysis with them, we can trust the analysis to be telling us something about the world. So here, this is the profile of Chicago, New York, LA across these 15 dimensions I was telling you about before. And these are z-scores. So the zero here is the national average. So 0 is what the average zip code is in the USA. Above is higher than average, below is lower than average. And the main thing to note is that there is this kind of common pattern across this whole profile, which is characteristic of most big cities, right? So there's a kind of just big city style of life, which we're all familiar with. Kind of one big city is kind of similar to any big city in various ways. And that's sort of captured by this less traditional, more self-expressive and utilitarian, less neighborly, and more glamorous, more transgressive, right? More rationalism, stronger sense of corporateness, right? That's what you find in any big city. And that idea, if you're thinking about classical social theory, that's definitely a Zemalian idea from Georg Simmel. But within that, and this is less Zemalian, there's variation. And again, we can see it expressed here, right? So this middle bar is Chicago. So Chicago, more traditionalistic, that's from those Catholic churches and family restaurants than New York and LA, less oriented towards individual self-expression, but still more than the average zip code, right? In the country, and so on down the line. More glamorous than the average zip code, but not quite as high as LA and New York, which are kind of off the charts, right? So we can get this profile of the culture of Chicago, and now we've got it quantified in numbers, and we can then, with those numbers, connect it to other measures that we've got, for example, of our economy, other measures from the census, like the educational composition, the income level, the racial composition, population density, and so on in any area. And then we can insert these into our kind of standard models of urban development and see how much these sort of cultural scene factors influence outcomes that we might care about. So that's into these other chapters. And I see I got about, I'm going to say 7 minutes or so. So I'm going to be kind of quick going through this so you can get a flavor for it. So this is our chapter on the economy. And it's called Back to the Land, Onto the Scene. And the sort of guiding intuition is that we can think of the scene as sort of like the land. Like if you're trying to if you're building a farm, the productivity of your farm depends on the quality of the soil. And in the same way, the productivity of many economic activities depend on the sort of nature of the scene that they're located in. And some scenes will help the economy in the area to grow, like this nice green thriving field over here. But if it's on a different kind of soil, cracked, at least with respect to that scene and those types of activities, it's not going to grow as well. So this is just some of my background. I love, well, I won't tell you about who. There's Weber, Talcott Parsons for the aficionados out there, but we don't need to go into all of that. So I'm going to just show you that when we found this and we were doing this analysis and we're getting these results, I was sort of new to this game of quantitative social research. And I didn't quite realize, honestly, like how big of a deal it was that we're getting these really strong results with these kinds of variables that we had created that no one else had looked at before. And so what we did is we were looking specifically at how traditionalistic a scene is. And there you can see the way we've measured it, how self-expressive it is, and how transgressive it is. And we're looking at the impact of that on a whole bunch of indicators of economic growth. Patents, change in jobs, change in population, change in income, change in rent, change in the college grads, percentage of the population. And this is controlling for, those standard kinds of measures, race, education, rent, population density, the surrounding county features as well. And you can see this strong impact from these measures across the board. So in scenes that are more oriented towards personal self-expression, you get growth in all of these economic indicators. It's quite incredible. And the magnitude of the impact is similar, or if not greater, to any of those other variables, similar to, often greater than, the impact of college educated share of the population, which if you know anything about the economic kind of development literature, that's often like taken to be like the most the single most important way of generating economic growth, increase the education level. But this is as strong. Staying true to that spirit of interchange, obviously the scene and the economy and the kinds of industry you have there are not kind of operating in isolation. And like the sort of classic story of this, at least in its heyday, which has some truth in some ways, is the story of, like, say, early Silicon Valley, where people would go work in their startup and then in the day, and then they hang out in the bars in the evening. And it was that kind of mixing of the bars and the startups, and the not just the physical presence of the bar, but the whole vibe of experimentation, going back to at least the 70s sort of Bay Area ethos of experimentation, innovation, creativity permeating the entire place, leads to the same business, in a way, having a kind of a greater opportunity for success than a almost similar, identical business placed somewhere else. So that's this model we're using, and we're trying to model that interaction there. And so what we're interested in is, here's technology industry clusters, scenes that promote self-expression, the direct effect of each on local economic development, but then here, the interaction. What happens when you have both compared to when you only have one or the other? And I won't go through how to read this graph in detail, but it's basically saying it's a very strong effect. The same industry cluster mixed with a highly self-expressive scene is way higher in its increasing in the job growth it generates than otherwise. So that's a really strong effect. When we do a whole bunch of other similar kind of mediation analysis, I could walk through these if you want, but these are also saying, there's this idea that comes out of some people, some authors like Richard Florida and others, that you know, if you get artists concentrated in a certain place, you're going to have the economy take off there. And we find actually that does have some support. But what we try to do is show that that depends on the scene. So when you have artists embedded, surrounded by a whole other kinds of activities that are conducive to what they're doing, all the kind of development potentials are greater than if you have just a bunch of other artists without that. So that kind of logic, people together with a supportive scene, sort of creates a kind of greater dynamism than you would otherwise have. Oh, this is the last one I'm going to show on the economy. I'm going to quickly say something about politics, and then I'll hand it over to Zach. This is another one. This I think is pretty. So we found a way to measure bohemianism. I won't go through the detail of right now, but again, we're trying to measure that kind of classic Parisian kind of bohemian neighborhood and where it's stronger or weaker. And this is being true to that idea of interchange and combination again. And now the proposition we were testing is this. Think about, I don't know if you know anything about it, but also think about sort of classic bohemian neighborhoods that really sort of took off. In their heyday, let's say, you know, the Latin Quarter in Paris, they were isolated. There was one kind of area that was where, you know, the artists and so on went in the city, but then they were kind of surrounded by a city that was understood by them to be oppositional. So that feeling of you know, who we are concentrated in this place, trying to live this life, but we're surrounded by a more conformist kind of city that is not happy with us. That's part of what gives it the energy, that kind of opposition. And you find that in, you know, 1850 Paris, you find it in 1910 Greenwich Village, you find it in 1960s Haight-Ashbury, and you found it in 1990s Wicker Park in Chicago, right? That's a sort of, so we tried to take that idea and now measure it, right? So that's an idea from, you know, humanistic kind of cultural studies. And this is basically showing that, yes, across the board, when a bohemian neighborhood is surrounded in a county that is anti-bohemian, all of the growth indicators are much higher than when it's not, right? So that intuition is true, and we can kind of demonstrate it here. I won't talk too much. This is about residential patterns, so I'll just kind of leave that aside. Again, we find very strong relationship type of scene and who ends up living there. And then we talk a bit about how we can use these ideas and these measurements to think about the extent to which we find cultural divides in the USA. We use here God, yoga, and karate to find strong differences in the types of neighborhoods that have a lot of emphasis on yoga versus the ones who have a lot of evangelical Christian churches. And we look for kinds of practices that bridge the divide that you find in both, that cut across the strong cleavages that are in many ways dividing the country along cultural lines. And we look at martial arts clubs as a kind of activity that actually spans many of the cleavages. We could talk about that more if you're interested in that, but it's quite amazing, the role of martial arts. What I'm going to conclude with is just saying, we also thought a lot about politics. Wait, where's, okay. And it's the same logic. Depending on the kind of lifestyle of the place, certain kinds of political activities will tend to thrive, even when those activities have very universalistic ambitions. They tend to be rooted in a place. And the question is, what are those types of places that are conducive to these kinds of activities? So in this case, we're looking at concentrations of new social movement type organizations. There's like human rights organizations, environmental activist organizations, things like that. And the main point is that you can see is that dark circles that are bigger are more strongly associated with either having any of those new social movements organizations or having like a lot of them, right? And so you can get an image of that kind of neighborhood. People walk there. The scene is much more artistically and self-expressively oriented. It's much more urbane. Remember on that first dimension I was telling you about, it doesn't have as much of those kind of community-oriented kinds of things. There's a lot of cultural employment, tends to be in democratic cities, higher rent, higher percent non-white, educated, so very dense, right? So these are neighborhoods where that really, if you've read Jane Jacobs yet, or that kind of image of a kind of diverse cosmopolitan kind of setting, people walking around, very diverse, very artsy, that's where you find new social movements, or they have universal ambitions, but they're very rooted in particular places, and they tend to appeal to people associated with that lifestyle. Now, that idea that there's a kind of lifestyle character of a place kind of is my segue over to Zach here, because that's one aspect of what we think about when we try to think about the basis of different political orientations and political neighborhoods. And then we again follow this principle of multidimensionality and interchange by trying to put that into different combinations with a few other factors, like the kinds of the nature of the groups who are there and where a place is located, and how those combine to generate different kinds of political outcomes in different cities. So what I'm going to do maybe is stop here. If you're interested, by the way, I did just do this. We can come back to these later. I'll give you a little taste of things we can come back to. This is the analysis of how county level scenes and other factors correlate, or this is a regression model, lead to different Democratic or Republican vote shares since 1996. Done now again to include the 2020 election, so you can really see the big patterns here. We'll come back and look at that because it's pretty fascinating. And then, like I said, I can, if we're interested in trends in the establishments and organizations in Chicago now over a 25-year period, I just calculated that, so we can kind of look through that and talk about that too, and what it says about the changing nature of cultural life and scenes in Chicago. Why? I'd be interested in hearing from everybody, you know, what stands out to you and why you think any of it's happening. But now I think it makes sense just sort of throw the baton over to Zach.
Perhaps one question first, Dan, or
Sure.
maybe a couple of questions about
Yeah.
the scenescape. So you're measuring 15 different dimensions in creating the scene or creating the neighborhood, or however one wants to think about it. And that's pretty complicated to do. Is there a way to simplify it, say, to 3 basic dimensions that could be more easily measured, so it could be incorporated into more studies that would keep most of the validity, but not necessarily the detail that you get with the full scenescape treatment?
It's an interesting idea. You know, I mean, the idea of doing these factor scores is to simplify it. So we're looking at just these 4 here rather than all 15 a lot of times, but we got there through this, you know, circuitous route, you know, and I hear what you're saying, you know, because I want to update this work, you know, and it's a lot of work to do it, you know, and the amount of work it takes to do it is something that definitely slows me down. I think that's something to think about. I mean, what I think would maybe be a way to do it is, first off, to go back to our original work and look at the sort of, you know, see if we can simplify this, and then we end up maybe measuring maybe these. I think you see my cursor, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe you could measure
directly.
just one factor on
Exactly.
you know, community and so forth.
Yeah.
You know, so maybe it was whatever tradition or you know, whichever one. And
We
like
measure just the
in
prime.
romanticism, you just measure self-expressive, and you know you would be losing some level of information, but the advantage would be many more people could utilize the method and combine it with their study of city council votes, or with their study of election outcomes, or whatever, if it were simpler to do.
That's a good idea. No, I think we should sort of create like a kind of toolkit to say here's like the minimal version, and you can get some, you know, valid results from that. And then if you want to go further, you could do these other things, right? But I think that's a terrific idea. I mean, one thing I have just started to be able to do with a colleague here, or who is a visiting scholar at Toronto, computer scientist from Brazil named Tiago Silva, who's very interested in, you know, this, you know, intersection of computer science and social science and urban research. Very creative guy. And he came up with a way to take the coding that we had done for all of our yellow pages and stuff, and then adapt it to other coding schemas and map it onto them semi-automatically. So we're able to take all of the coding we did for the yellow pages and the business census, and then map it on fairly well to Yelp's entire category schema. So now we've got these measures for Yelp. We didn't have to go through all of this. So we're just working on it now. So this kind of conversation with computer scientists thinking about natural language processing also helps to sort of, you know, semi-automate some of these things. And so I'm learning that too. So that's another direction. But I really take that. That's a really, really helpful suggestion.
Mitch, you had a question?
Yeah, and I think you might have had a little bit of a slide on it, but you ran over it a little bit. But you know, what's like the effect of like long-term residents versus new residents in an area on the scene? And you know, do long-term residents create a scene and then bring in new residents that cause the old residents not want to be there anymore? And I'm just like, I'm sure there's lots of like penduluming there that happens.
Yeah, we don't have, that's a great idea. We don't have like a measure of that per se here, like the residents that we have looked at exactly with quantitatively. I have studied those kinds of things in more depth in Toronto with qualitative studies of neighborhoods, and also with some of like the Canadian GSS General Social Survey allows you to do neighborhood level analysis. And there they have a question about like, how long have you lived in the neighborhood? And you get things like trust and so on. I'll just tell you one little tidbit I find interesting. It's not directly seen, but it sort of points in that direction. This is Canada. I believe it would hold in the US too. So first off, in Toronto, at least, I think about something like 70% of the residents have lived in their neighborhood for like 10 years or more. It's a really high percentage. So there's much less mobility. I think that's just maybe just Canada versus United States. But then we were measuring confidence in various institutions, which is sort of related to this, like the whole range of kind of questions that are typically asked about confidence in institutions. Like how much confidence do you have in the government, in the media, corporations, and so on and so forth. And new residents, so people just moving in, now mostly immigrants to Canada, come in with much higher confidence in institutions than everybody else, way higher. But every single year you spend in the country, your confidence goes down. So, and that's an interesting process, right? And so it speaks to this, you know, there is a difference between, you know, being a newcomer in a place and living there for a while. Now, I think why that's happening is because I'm an immigrant to Canada, and that was my experience. I came in very excited and hopeful, and like, wow, we got this free healthcare. It's so great, and I still appreciate it all. But now I took on sort of more of the local orientation, which is to complain about things a lot. So, so that is what. The other thing I'd say on that, I don't know if you read any of the work in this class of Japonica Brown Saraceno. I don't know if that is something you guys are going to be reading. But she has a good article on this kind of concept of old timers and also newcomers to neighborhood who really value the presence of the old timers and do what they can to kind of preserve their role in the neighborhood. So she calls them neighborhood preservationists. And the point there is it's not a one-track thing, you know, it's not just there's the old people and the new people replace the old people and so on. You have a range of things where some new people really value what the existing people have to offer, and they try to actively do things to try to preserve the character of the scene. So the point is, again, it goes with these kind of value orientations and what's animating things.
Ujay, you had a question?
Oh, can I ask a really quick follow-up?
Yes, Mitch.
Really quick on that. So one other thing is, have you like read about like third places, and do third places have like a role in these scenes too? Like, is that like a pretty like strong part of it?
Yeah, that's a really kind of core idea. I mean, what we're actually measuring for the most part would probably count as third places, you know, but not all of them, because we're interested in both sort of, you know, we're interested in the stuff there, and the activities that you do in that, right? And in a very open way. So like if you've got, let's say, a lot of cafes, it's a third space. But ideally, we'd like to know a little bit more about the kind of activity going on there, right? So is it a cafe that's like, you know, kind of like the one down the street from me here, that's like, you know, old Italians hang out there, and you would, you know, and it's really for them to hang out, and you know, it's their kind of Mediterranean social club, it's called, you know, or is it a Starbucks, or is it a place where you've got like poetry slams going on, like Friday night, right? So we're kind of interested in right? The third space and what's going on. And then also what we probably are not third spaces, like you know, like if you've got like a stockbroker lining your street, right? I don't think that's a third space, right? You know, but it's gonna project something about the kind of place it is, right? And the kind of scene you're in. So
We'll
we're kind
come
of,
back to additional questions, but let's do very quickly, Wujay and then Rodrigo. Ask your questions quickly, and then we're going to move to Zach, and then we'll come back.
Oh, my question's kind of brief. So you talked about self-expression and glamour
Mhm.
being keys to local economic development. Like artists are important. How does Chicago compare to other cities? Like for example, like I expect you to say, well, we have more artists. We're more like, self-expressive. We are more glamorous. So you expect Chicago to do better than other cities or something like that.
on average overall or in specific
well-
parts of it?
On average.
It's an interesting question, you know, like this, remember, we're doing this analysis at the zip code level. So we're really thinking about, you know, local neighborhoods. So it's really more about maybe, I mean, it can be Chicago as a whole, but we're thinking, think about the neighborhoods in Chicago that have, you know, seen a lot of growth. You know, which ones is it, you know?
All right.
So
Thank you.
that is the
Okay.
idea.
Rodrigo?
Thank you. Just a quick question. I find it very fascinating that this sort of scene methodology can pinpoint up to some amount the partisanship of certain zip codes and the partisanship of the scene. I was wondering how far that travels when we're talking about countries or cities with multiple parties. By multiple, I mean more than two. And so I know that there's some studies on scenes in other cities and countries. And so I wanted to ask, do they sort of reflect general feelings towards progressivism and conservatism? Or is it more something along the lines of, I can see certain dimensions being more radical than others, and that sort of logic?
Well, in some way, that's a perfect segue for what Zach is going to be talking about because London is a multi-party system, and Toronto is officially nonpartisan. So some of this variation will come in there. The only thing, let's see if I can do this. Ooh, I haven't looked at this this graph in a long time. But we did have this. We had for Canada, we had good data from a individual level survey from a big polling firm that asked all these political questions and said which electoral districts people lived in, and we could then link that to the scene. And so we did really find like sort of what you're talking about. So this is individuals. We're looking at individuals in the context in which they are, and then we have a left-right scale, right? So it's similar to what you're saying, and you can see when we're lower in our self-expression measure, we're higher up in conservatism. And then as we come down over here, to the right, we're getting more self-expressive, and we're more on the left, right? And you find kind of the opposite trend. This was, I try to remember, I think this was something I thought was really interesting when we did it. But what we found here, though, the interesting thing here is these three lines are breaking up the individuals by their education level. And the main thing we were finding is that the effect, the difference, like going, you know, from a low self-expression place to a high self-expression place, you can see this line comes down way more. Like, look at how much it comes down. This is people with less education, whereas the higher educated individuals that are going only from 5 to 4, right? These guys are going down from 6 to 4.5, right? So basically, what that means is that depending on your own education level, you are affected in your politics more or less by shifting your scene. Does that make sense? You know, you see what I'm saying? So that raises the kind of interesting question, right? Like, why is it that people with more education sort of stick to their political attitudes as they move from one scene to another, whereas people with less education are more influenced by what's surrounding them. Anyway, that's what this is showing. So there is a shift, but it depends on who you are.
And so we'll switch over to Zach, and why don't you start for like 15 minutes and then we'll take our break, Zach, and then come back to the 2 articles.
All right.
Oh, you should be able to share. Yeah.
Yeah, are we good? Can you see
Yep.
it?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. So, this has been a really amazing journey that I've been on with Dan for about 8 years now.
Wow,
When I
it's been
first
so long.
met Dan, I know. Well, so back in 2013 or so, being a political scientist, I was not really exposed to the kind of intellectual milieu that Dan came from. Scenescapes had not yet been published. I was interested in Toronto politics, and in particular, I had come from a background in urban planning in Toronto, and had eventually gone back to school for political science PhD, and became actually got a job as a academic political scientist. And so because of my planning background, I had done some GIS type stuff, and I was interested in mapping election results and trying to understand why there was such an extreme spatiality of support by voters for different candidates in local elections that ostensibly nobody cares about and are nonpartisan. So what drives all this? So I had been noodling around with some stuff, incorporating it into my teaching, and somehow Dan found me because of that. And I can't remember exactly how, but I remember our first meeting. And Jan During, who's now at McGill University, also from University of Chicago originally, was at University of Toronto as a postdoc at that time, and we just started this discussion, which culminated in applying for a grant, getting the grant, doing a whole bunch of tail chasing of trying out different ideas. Dan had these extraordinary intuitions that I now understand were coming out of the Scenescapes project that I knew nothing about. And the cross-pollination was really quite fascinating. So we've there's several articles that have come out of this, including the one that you've read, and there's sort of more coming out of it. And we hope to we're on the scenic route, if I can use that phrase, Dan, to preparing a book manuscript that brings together a lot more diverse range of data sources to approach this question. So with that preamble, what this is mutated into is I've started calling it the Urban Archipelago Project. Originally, we called it the Place and Politics Project, but a key concept that in what we've been working through is this idea that neighborhoods are not islands, right? And a lot of the kind of primordial research on neighborhoods isn't really relational. What it does is it looks at individual neighborhoods and as if they're islands. But of course, these things exist in a metropolitan context, and that's kind of what I'm communicating with this visualization here on this opening slide, and it becomes an important part of our work. So, ultimately what this is about is the broader project is about an exploration about how space matters for politics. And there's of course a rich tradition of this in political and electoral geography, to some degree in sociology, and much to my disciplinary shame as a political scientist, not really at all in political science, because political science has gone so deep into individual level analysis and into political psychology that I think they've kind of lost the ability to think sociologically and sociospatially about political behavior. So I find I'm often alone when I talk about this to my own political science audience. But basically, we know a whole bunch of things about cities and the way that they're internally variegated, right? We know that there's race, class, segregation, other dimensions of segregation. We know, and this is dear to me coming out of an urban planning background, we know that cities have quite different built environment types in different areas. We know that mobility behaviors vary considerably depending on where within a city you live. We know that there's huge variation in access to amenities and so on, food deserts and et cetera. And we also know that resources are allocated spatially in urban politics. This is something that urban political economy people have studied for many years and understand well, that there are winners and losers, and these often play out spatially, right? There are winning and losing parts of cities. And what these do is, what these patterns set up are kind of durable interests in one's place, and durable identities that are attached to those interests. Overlaid on this is, of course, an institutional dimension, because, big cities in many parts of the world, and certainly in North America, political representation is based on geography, right? We have wards, and within wards we have precincts or voting subdivisions of some kind. And so there's a spatiality in which people express themselves politically. And of course, back to sociology and University of Chicago School sociology in particular, there's this rich tradition of exploring the idea of neighborhood effects, right? Basically, that your neighborhood context affects something at the individual level, whether it's a life outcome or an attitude or a behavior or whatever. So what all of this leads to in a kind of encompassing intuition is the idea that political conflict in cities is often spatially articulated. Just because a citywide race may be close, that doesn't mean that the race is close in any one part of the city, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so it's useful to think of politics as a spatial process. So the meta question for me is, what is urban politics really about? And does this vary in different contexts, different social, economic, institutional contexts? So we have come to an understanding of the neighborhood as a bundle, and this sort of fits with the way Dan described the kind of holism and interactive nature of a neighborhood. Neighborhoods have different parts, right? They are defined by clustered attributes. We can think of these in contextual or compositional terms. So we can think of built environments, reputation, access to services and amenities. Compositionally, we can think of race, ethnicity, language, religion. We can think of socioeconomic status. We can think of educational attainment. And these things combine to generate material interests and lifestyles, which in turn generate identities, which, if politicized, become spatial cleavages that we can observe in electoral behavior. So that's really the foundation of where we went in the UAR paper. We compared 3 cities. We started with Toronto because that's where we were. That's certainly where the data were available and where it all began. And we went through a painful process of digitizing from paper records the maps of all the electoral precincts and the results of them for some of the elections. We then decided, after a painful publishing misfire, that comparative research would probably help. So we looked around the world and determined that London had really good off-the-shelf data that we could put to work. And so we added a London case study. And then Chicago came third, despite the fact that 2 of our number were actually, schooled in Chicago and knew Chicago quite well. Chicago came third. We did look at other cities like, New York and Los Angeles and so on. But weirdly, Chicago has quite accessible data, electoral data, and the ability to map it and so on. So we started in the 90s and kind of worked over a 20-year period with this, looking at neighborhood scale results of mayoral elections. There's a whole technical aspect of this, of assembling the data, which was a lot of fun, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But basically, the technique that Dan devised is, he said, okay, in these places that have nonpartisan elections, we can't just sort of call them Republicans and Democrats, or we can't give names to these different candidates. They are themselves. So the only way to really understand whether there are durable political orientations to neighborhoods over time is to use a dimensional reduction technique like principal component analysis. So you throw all the neighborhoods across all your years into a single PCA, and it identifies the latent dimensionality of the voting behavior. And that's the kind of backbone of where this begins. So once we identify neighborhoods that have durable political orientations, then the strategy, much like with Scenescapes, is what does this correlate with? So working at the same geography, we have all kinds of census data. We have data about the physical attributes of the neighborhood. We have things like the amenity data that Dan talked about as well. And we think of these different neighborhood characteristics as embodying three different aspects of political life, right? Group aspects, so the compositional nature of who the people are, what their race, ethnicity, language, religion, and so on. Place-based things, which are about the physical place characteristics, walkability, and so on. And then location-based interests, and the way to think about that is how far away is it from kind of the center of the city, and that is inflected by transportation system access and so on. And then we look at interactions between variables. So that's the strategy that you saw in the UAR paper. Just to talk a little bit about the assembly of the precinct level election data in Chicago. Starting in 2003, this stuff is available digitally, and it was possible to kind of mash it together in a fairly straightforward way. But this isn't in the UAR paper, but we wanted to go back in time. And we eventually wanted to go back in time. So I found out that the Chicago Democracy Project, some of you may be familiar with that, was at Northwestern. In its first iteration back in the 90s, they digitized all this stuff, and then they lost it. So we knew that it existed, but it was no longer accessible. So I eventually figured out that the guy who had done a fair amount of the work on it was Jaime Dominguez, who some of you might know. He's still working in some capacity at Northwestern. And he emailed me back and said, yeah, I just moved to a new house, and there's like a Rubbermaid tub in my garage, and it has these old discs in there. I might still have this stuff. And they were in a disk format that basically no longer exists. I had to like buy a disk drive, an antique disk drive, and ultimately I got a hold of it. All this data back to the early 70s, a time that Dick Simpson knows very well. So it's been a really remarkable situation. But what we're able to do is look at the geography of these elections, and what you see in these kind of crude maps right here, 2015 general election. We look at these vote shares going from 0 to 100%. And you just see the geography of this. You see Chuy Garcia, and you see Rahm Emanuel, of course, and you can say, okay, I understand spatially, knowing Chicago, what the coalitions are, the racial coalitions that create all this. But then there's these sort of lower tier candidates like Bob Fioretti and Pete Wilson, who where you could see the traces of it. Right, you can see how Fioretti was appealing to these kind of people right at the periphery of the city, right, with his particular kind of business technical campaign that appealed to a certain kind of suburban voter, the white ethnic kind of bungalow belt voter. And then you look at Wilson, and you see kind of a trace of a different coalition based on race. So, that these are the raw materials that we assembled to do this. So ultimately, when we compare these three cities, we find that voting behavior is highly spatially articulated. This is sort of a word that we came up with for this. Even when races seem fairly close, at the citywide level, there are generally local landslides. So any given neighborhood is generally has a pretty substantial margin of victory, and that's true in all three of our cities. Two of them with nonpartisan elections, one of them with partisan elections, but at least 60% of the neighborhoods were won with a greater than 20% margin over this 20-year period, and that's pretty wild, given that local politics is not supposed to matter, and or matter to anybody, and you know, the issues aren't supposed to be all that important, and two of these cities are in nonpartisan situations. So we run it through the principal component analysis, and we find that in fact neighborhood voting is low dimensional after all. That
Zach, let's
about 70. Oh, do you want to take the break now?
Let's take our break now for 15
All right.
minutes, and then
For sure.
we can come back to this slide and continue the discussion. So we'll be back at, let's call it in Central Time 5:20, and we'll pick up from there.
All right, sounds great, Dick. Thank you.